I spend a lot of time on the internet. And over the last few years, I've started to notice something. Everything kind of looks the same. And if you spend a lot of time on the internet as well, which I'm guessing you do, you know what I'm talking about. Websites that look like this, or this, or this. They all kind of follow the same pattern. At the top, you have a logo on the left and navigation on the right. Underneath that is a full-width hero header image with prominent sans serif type, usually white, overlaid on top. And underneath is a big, flat primary button that's used as a call to action. Below that, you have a column of items, usually 3, almost always illustrated with an image, photo, or icon. And it looks nice, and it works well, but it's so common as to have become a cliché. These are websites for different things. They communicate different messages. Education software isn't the same thing as a water filter. When everything looks the same, how do we distinguish between them? Now, the web didn't always look like this. So we're going to go back into the past and see how we ended up here. By a quick show of hands, how many people here are new to the web, have gotten into design and development in the last 5 years? Okay, what about the last 10 years? And has anybody been doing it for longer than 10 years? That is a lot of hands. Okay, so for some of you, this will be very familiar. For the rest of you, I'm sorry. The internet has been in development since the 60s, but what we know today as the modern web really came about in the early 90s. And at that point, the web was just text. This is the very first website using HTML that was ever published. It's still online. It was published in '91 by Tim Berners-Lee, and it was just text. No images, no colors, just text and some links. It was still really early days here. In November of '92, there were a total of 26 web servers in the world. But by the mid-'90s, our browser technology had advanced a little bit, and we could do more. We could embed images in our websites. We can use colors, not great colors, but colors. And we can use tables to place elements on our page. This is what Apple's website looked like in 1997. Now, by modern standards, this looks pretty simple, but that sidebar navigation is actually an image map. And changing the color of the links when you hovered over them required a lot of JavaScript. At this point, the best way to design a website was to build the layout in Photoshop or Quark Express or some graphic editor, and then cut the whole layout up into lots of different component images. So you'd have an image for a line, for any bits of header text, for any graphic element on the page. Then you'd put all those little images inside a bunch of tables in order to place everything on your page. Now, invariably, you'd have to fiddle with this quite a lot. To get placement exact, you'd need to use spacer GIFs, which were a lot of blank images used as placeholders. And then you'd end up having tables nested inside tables, even for pretty simple layouts. We had code soup. And if you think that the code looked bad, the websites looked even worse. This wasn't a good time for websites. And we still didn't have CSS, so everything had to be declared manually in HTML tags. In order to make every link on this page yellow, you had to manually declare the color of every single individual link. It was a lot of work to make something that looked this bad. But everything was new at this point. And even bad tools are better than nothing. So we used them all, indiscriminately. We used frames, hit counters, we put animated GIFs everywhere. It was a new and exciting time for the web. The concept of being able to build a personal website to share your hobbies and interests with people halfway around the world was really powerful. It sort of still is. And in all that excitement, we didn't really come across any restraint. Now, by 1996, 1% of the global population was online, so still pretty early. And CSS was introduced. CSS allowed us more tools to control how things looked. This wasn't always a good thing. So you can change the properties of your browser scroll bar to make it purple and yellow and on the wrong side and 3 times its usual size. You can also turn a cursor into a robot unicorn or have it spit out sparkles and rainbows as you move your cursor around the screen. There are actually multiple plugins for WordPress that do this, but please don't use these. At this point, accessibility and usability of our websites wasn't really a big concern. It was '98. We just wanted to make stuff that looked cool. Around the same time, Flash came about, and this allowed us to experiment more and to have more control. Print designers loved Flash because it was a visual way of designing a site. You had a fixed box for your content, and you could design within that. You could also experiment with animation. You could use typefaces that weren't the 6 web-safe typefaces available, and you could design in a really purely visual way. By the early 2000s, things started to change again. At this point, the web isn't really a new medium anymore. And with increased familiarity, we had an increased knowledge and awareness of what we could do versus what we should do. And this led to a refining of tastes. At this point, web design starts to feel like a thing. Websites begin to feel like they've been deliberately designed, like they're a cohesive whole. And you see the rise of new and distinct trends within web design. One of my personal favorites was the grunge trend, which used distressed textures, layered patterns, and handmade elements to give an imperfect and tactile feel to the page. This was mimicking real-life objects. And the flip side of that, you see the poorly named Web 2.0 trend, which was effectively the same idea in terms of mimicking real-life objects, but a completely different implementation. So Web 2.0 used lots of shadow and light effects everywhere, lots of gradients, glossy and beveled buttons everywhere, and this weird trend of having a mirror effect for logos, even when they weren't sitting on anything that would be reflective. The iPhone built on the idea of mimicking real-life objects. The first iPhone came out in 2007, and this presented a new challenge. Suddenly, we had a new kind of device that was being introduced to users who weren't that technologically adept. And so we needed a way to teach those users without alienating them. And so you see the rise of skeuomorphism in design. Skeuomorphism is a derivative object that mimics design elements of the original. And what that means is this. If you know that reading a book works like this, it has some pages, and in order to move to the next page, you pull in the bottom right-hand corner, and then you build an interface that looks like a book. It has pages and a spine and maybe a ribbon running down the center, and then when you press your finger to the bottom right-hand corner of a page, you move to more content. That's skeuomorphism. That's an affordance that links a new interface with an object you already understand how to use. And this allows a user to intuitively learn your interface without having to read a manual. The popularity of the iPhone led to mass adoption of mobile, and suddenly people were reading the web on their phones. This in turn led to the rise of responsive design, somewhere around 2010. And with this, we see another shift in design practices. Invariably, as our technology changes, so does the way we design. And suddenly, we needed to scale our designs for a lot of different devices and resolution. We also needed to think about performance, because people will be using a mobile connection to download sites. And so it became hard to use these very image-heavy designs, both in terms of visual performance and performance. And so we see flat design come about. Flat design was actually pioneered by Microsoft in their Metro UI, which is now called Microsoft Design Language. Metro ditched all gradients, all shadow. It used just flat blocks of color everywhere. And this approach makes it really simple to adapt a design to different devices and resolutions. But when they tested it, they found that users missed important parts of the interface. If your buttons don't look buttony, people won't know they're buttons. And so a lot of flat design today isn't completely flat. Material design, for instance, uses some shadow and light effects to differentiate between objects, particularly important ones like floating action buttons. Now, material design was a design language intended for use in Google products, but I keep seeing it cropping up in stuff that isn't for Google at all. It allows non-designers to easily make something that looks pretty good, but the trouble is that it's quite prescriptive, and it was never intended to be applied to everything. Bootstrap suffers from the same problem. It was the most starred repo on GitHub for ages. It's now dropped back, so maybe it's decreasing in popularity. It was originally built for Twitter as an internal tool called Twitter Blueprint. And the idea was that you'd use it for rapid prototyping. If you wanted to test an idea, you could build out a site really quickly and then find out if it worked or not. If it worked, you would design a final product using an actual design phase. You can do lots with Bootstrap, but the result is very similar looking sites. You can customize Bootstrap so that it doesn't look like a Bootstrap site, but most people don't. The rise of flat design and all these new tools and frameworks, non-designers have an easier entry into design. It's relatively easy to build something that looks good without using a graphic editor or having a knowledge of the underlying design principles. And while ultimately that's good, it can also contribute to a more homogeneous internet. In order to build something that's great, you need to have an understanding of design. Now, you may think, okay, this doesn't apply to me, I'm not a designer. But if you're making websites, you're making design decisions. If you're working with a designer, if you're choosing colors or typefaces, you're making the web. You're involved in those decisions. And design isn't just about making stuff pretty. It's also about solving a problem. It's about understanding the needs of your client and the needs of your audience, and about communicating a message. There isn't any one-size-fits-all solution to every problem. Now, historically, designers and developers have been very different people with different aims and goals and motivations. But more and more, this isn't the case. It's rare to find a web designer who doesn't know HTML these days. I like to think of web design and development as a spectrum rather than a binary. Most people in the field fall somewhere in the middle. It used to be that you would have designers with a print background who design the whole of your website in a graphic editor, and then they'd hand it off to a developer for implementation. But now, most web designers are aware of the technical constraints of the web while they're designing for it, even if they're not doing the implementation themselves. And I think that that prior knowledge of the technical constraints of the web might be holding us back. Now, constraints can be good. They often engender creativity. We devise clever solutions to work around them or within them. But in the case of the web, we literally think inside the box. Because the technical constraints of the web require box-shaped elements, we build box-shaped sites. Now, of course, to stay relevant as a designer, you do need to follow trends to some degree. What we find beautiful is very much shaped by our culture and by the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And this is evident in all forms of art and design, from fashion to music to architecture. Scientists have always assumed that human beings have a biological preference for harmonic sounds. But they ran some studies with some Amazonian tribes who had limited previous exposure to Western culture. And they found that the tribes weren't bothered by discordant sounds at all. That preference that they believe to be biological is actually completely defined by our culture. And so understanding the world and its current aesthetics is vital to remaining relevant. The flip side of that, of course, is that an over-reliance on trends means that your design becomes dated really quickly. Think about the swoosh logos that were ubiquitous in the 90s, or those glossy beveled buttons of Web 2.0. That's fine if you want to redesign a website every year, but most people don't have time for that. It's worth noting here as well that standard UI conventions aren't trends. This is how users find things. It's how they make sense of your interface. Don't rewrite convention just for the sake of it. Nielsen Group found that if you moved a logo from the top left of a page to the top center of the page, users find it 6 times harder to navigate back to the home. So only break the rules if you have a good reason for doing so. Don't alienate your users. And the same goes for accessibility. Ultimately, it's better to have a usable and accessible site than one that's really creative. But I believe that we can work within these constraints and still build great websites. Now, much of design is driven by trends. Slavishly following those trends doesn't really account for your project's needs. Design is about communicating a message from your client to your audience. If your audience can't distinguish between a hospital and a music festival, your meaning is lost and their understanding is diminished. Visual patterns are a language. They have meaning. Think about what you're communicating. What's trendy isn't always going to be what's right for your project. All fields of design need innovation to drive forward, and the web is no exception. Web design desperately needs new ideas right now. Okay, so it's all good saying be different, buck trends, be your own special snowflake. But how do we actually do that? How do we design websites that don't look like every other website out there, while still accounting for UI conventions, accessibility, and modern tastes? I have some ideas. First of all, we don't need everything to be totally flat. I expect that we'll move away from flat design pretty soon anyway. All trends are cyclical, and flat designs are going to look super dated in a year from now. So try playing with texture and pattern. When used well, these can add dimension and visual interest to our design work. And we don't even need to use images for them all the time anymore. You can use SVG or CSS filters. As human beings, we respond to natural and organic objects. It's why we feel an emotional connection to hardwood floors, but not so much to steel girders or glass windows. For the same reason, hand-drawn elements are effective, particularly if we want to impart an emotional reaction in our audience. These subtle imperfections of organic objects humanize what can otherwise be a very sterile interface. Try playing around with typography. Don't just use Proxima Nova and call it a day. It's a beautiful typeface, but it's extremely overused. Beware as well of distinct but commonly used typefaces. Often Google fonts can fall into this trap. Think about Lobster, that was really trendy a couple of years ago, or one of my personal favorite typefaces, Playfair, which I think is beautiful, but I can't use it anymore because I've seen it used on corporate sites and sports sites and all kinds of places where it really doesn't suit. So think about your message and choose something that suits that message. Take inspiration from classic typography. Try some unusual combinations. Use serifs or slab serifs. Try scripts or display faces for headings. You can get pretty creative with type these days, and we're really not limited in the way that we used to be. Try using oversized type or breaking type outside of its box. This can add interest even if you're using a relatively plain typeface. Blowing up the type makes it an illustrative element. Using a drop cap achieves the same effect, and we can now use initial letter, which is getting more browser support, in order to have really fine-grained control over a drop cap. try getting creative with layout to avoid that boxy site syndrome. The concept of breaking the grid is one that's really traditional to print design, but it hasn't moved over to the web very much. And we can now break things outside of that box. If you're not familiar with this concept, I recommend a book called Making and Breaking the Grid, which talks about building a grid and then pulling things outside of it. But the basic concept is like this. You have an underlying grid for your page, and you align every element on your page to that grid. This makes it nice and orderly and makes everything feel balanced. And then you take an important element and you pull it outside of those grid lines. This gives that element more visual weight, and it also adds dynamic tension to your page, so it's more interesting to look at. You can also try using non-boxy shapes. You can break type around objects. We have all these new tools we can play with. We can use Flexbox and CSS columns. We can skew and rotate things. We can use SVG clipping masks. Even something relatively simple, like using a squiggle instead of an underline, or using multiple borders around images, or just applying a color tint to photos, adds character and visual interest to what is otherwise the exact same layout structurally as every other website. Animation is a great way of adding interest. And again, these tools have really been expanding lately. Oftentimes, you don't even need JavaScript in order to do animation. So this website is a good example of this. It does a lot of different things well. It uses big type for interest. It puts elements in unusual places. And the transition between states is pretty lovely. It's not too aggressive, but it's really notable. Now, with animation, it's very easy to go overboard. So use a delicate hand. A little does go a long way. Try to avoid animating too much or too aggressively. As a rule of thumb, animate elements that are interactive, and animate them on the interaction. Don't just push out every element as you're scrolling down the page. That can be a little dizzying. Finally, get outside your comfort zone. Look outside of the web for inspiration. One of the coolest things about design is that it's everywhere. It's on airport signage, it's on billboards, it's on restaurant menus, it's on packaging. It's impossible to escape. Viewing design through a wider lens will improve your work and give you new ideas. So look at packaging design, or look at hand lettering, where typography and illustration converge. Read fashion magazines. There's some amazing photography there and great use of color. Look at fashion itself. It's a great way to investigate the intersection of form and function. Film titles, both modern and new, are a great source of inspiration in terms of animation. There's lots of pattern and textile inspiration to be found in interior design. Be aware this is a dangerous path to go in. As mentioned, I'm redoing my bathroom, and I decided I wanted this pattern on the floor in tiny little mosaic hex tiles. They don't come like that, so I hand glued 3,000 of them in 2 days before I came down here. Go for a long walk. Look at graffiti or signage. Look at magazines. Magazines do great things in terms of layout, and a lot of them do that breaking the grid thing. Get out and go to museums. Not just art and design museums, but also science museums, history museums. Displays are a great way to understand interactive design. This allows you to experience design in the real world and to interact with it. Read print media. Book covers are great in terms of illustration and conceptual thinking. There are so many things out there to inspire you. So embrace a multidisciplinary approach to design. Interact with design in a new way, and bring that passion and learning back to your web work. Don't just look to the web for inspiration. This creates a vicious cycle where everything looks like everything else. So look outside. And once you're inspired, try experimenting. Take a magazine layout and recreate it in CSS as an exercise. This is a great way to learn how to use new tools. Try your hand at calligraphy or hand lettering. Build furniture, paint things. Make time for creative play, even if it's just a few minutes a week. And don't just experiment with code, but also with other disciplines. Experimentation is how we discover new things. Bucking trends is how we make new trends. So take risks. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You can make the web a better, more diverse, more interesting place. Thank you.